I'm going to quickly introduce Sebastian. Many of you know Sebastian Ritscher from More Books Literary Agency, based in Germany and in Switzerland. Sebastian's well known for many years of excellent deal making. Has worked with authors and with publishers around the world to make deals in German, etc. But the reason he's here today is because he also has an amazing brain for technology and for seeing clearly how to, let's say, make rights right. Let's leave it at that. And I know he's going to talk a lot, and that's the important thing. So come on up and let's hear from you. Thank you, Sebastian.
Well, hello and welcome everybody. It's a funny thing. On the way here, on the flight from Zurich, I wrote down some notes on my laptop on MS Word, and because I'm based in Europe, the format is DIN A4, and I arrived in New York and went to the hotel desk and I asked them if they could print it out. And what they printed, of course, is US letter format. This is DIN A4. I'm going to talk a little bit about standardizing things. So I thought that was quite fun. So good morning. First, I want to thank BISG for the opportunity to be here today with you to talk about rights in publishing. I also want to thank Frankfurter Book Fair and Jürgen Boers for sponsoring and co-sponsoring this event.
Mic, so you don't have to move.
Okay, thank you.
Better for your back.
Chris and Brian have asked me to share some thoughts and experiences from my practice as a literary agent with you. And you might ask, why me? Oops. No, this doesn't work. I'm trying to move to the next slide. I have this little controller, but technology. Thank you. So, my name is Sebastian Ritscher. I own and run More Books, a literary agency in Zurich that sells German translation rights for international clients. I joined More Books when I was a 23-year-old student of English literature and linguistics. My interest in contemporary English poetry was paired with a lifelong interest in mechanics and a curiosity in how things work. I was the agency's youngest employee when my boss brought a Brother word processor to the office. The year was 1989. He placed it on my desk and he asked me to figure out how to use it. It had a floppy disk. I remained the agency's tech guide. I bought its first computer and developed its first database after Germany's unification, early 1990s. It replaced the Rolodex, and it only contained contact information about books and contracts, and submissions were kept on file cards at that time. A contact management system became necessary because the 4-digit zip codes were no longer sufficient in unified Germany. The country needed more than 10,000 postcodes. That was the moment when More Books went digital. Later, I introduced email to the company, configured its robotics 56K modem, bought its first printer, etc. More Books is a sub-agency It sells German translation rights on behalf of international clients. Sublicensing is a business-to-business operation. It involves brokering and agenting. It does not involve a lot of direct author contact. Sub-agents provide knowledge of their specific market, brokerage and agenting, i.e. administration, negotiation, production support, contracts, royalty reports, payments, tax exemptions. Sublicensing is quite heavy on admin stuff. In 2012, I developed a user interface for German editors to interact with the agency, where they could manage their submission online and where we could keep them up to date. That effort developed into a software called RightsDesk, a global marketplace for rights vendors who want to show and promote their translation rights, manage their submission process, collaborate with sub-agents, or use secure file sharing and messaging. By that time, the high volume of emails had become a problem. RightsDesk was supposed to be part of the solution. RightsDesk does not offer any commission-based agency services. It's not an agency, but a marketplace for professional users. Unfortunately, RightsDesk did not take off as I had hoped. I promoted it to other agencies and rights departments as a collaborative tool, and I met with initial interest in the idea. Eventually, however, it failed to attract enough users to pay for its maintenance. Today, it's a white label database that publishers use to promote translation rights to the books they publish for display on their website. This is because RightsDesk knows how to categorize rights, and it provides a messaging system. Publishers' own systems often don't. In the context of this talk, I think it's interesting to consider for a moment why RightsDesk was not such a great success. One problem, data integration. Companies lock their data up in systems, often paper-based ones. That makes it hard for them to communicate with other systems. The initial effort of providing structured data seems too much to many. During the course of promoting RightsDesk to my colleagues, I learned a few other things about publishing and IT in rights. First, some publishers and many agencies are unhappy with the database they currently use. Secondly, IT infrastructure and management often is not a priority. Some publishers don't want to make rights information available online at all. There is some adversity to using collaborative tools, another password to remember. There is a preference for using legacy methods, like printed rights guides at book fairs. And finally, I often met with skepticism towards using software as a sales tool, because agenting is a sales business, is a people's business. It's about the magic of hand selling. So Chris and Brian must have heard about my interest in the mechanics of rights and my misadventures in taking an industry-wide initiative to digitize rights management when they asked me to talk about rights and doing rights right. Let me add this disclaimer. I have spent a bit of time and resources about rights in a digital marketplace, but I'm a literary agent, not an engineer. I don't write code. My business is agenting, not software. I run a small business, and what I can tell you is limited by that perspective. I sell translation rights, so that is my focus. And finally, I strongly believe in the value of hand selling, the value of the beauty of human interaction, the value of human experience in knowing a specific market, and in knowing the commercial value of a book project. I believe that humans are better than machines in solving everyday business problems and in handling the diplomatic nuances of negotiation. However, having said that, I also see value in using good technology to increase efficiency in certain areas, to reduce copy and paste jobs, to make more time available for productive work. Let me zoom in on a simple real-life example that may seem familiar to some of you. This could be an email from a French person named Jacqueline to an American colleague named John. Both work in rights departments for their publishers. Jacqueline's translation license has expired. She wants to renew it, but she isn't very specific about her request. John controls those rights because his company acquired them from the author via a primary agent. So the email could say, "Dear John, our agreement for Les Écrits has expired. We want to prolong for 5 years. All the best, Jacqueline." Let's say both are responsible for selling rights to a large catalog of front and backlist titles. Both manage hundreds, maybe thousands of active contracts, sublicenses, permissions. They have to deal with a high volume of permission requests like this one. John has more than 100 emails per day to deal with. And he has this big new novel to sell. But now John has to deal with this request. His problem is Jacqueline only mentions the translated French title of the book. There are 3 scenarios how to solve this problem. First, there's the anecdotal method. In this scenario, John doesn't have a good database. He responds by email and he starts a conversation that could lead anywhere. He needs to follow up if Jacqueline doesn't respond. He needs to involve others for approval. Finally, somebody has to draft a document, identify all involved parties, edit its language, go through another round of approvals, circulate the documents for digital signatures, check its authenticity when signing, and monitor the signing process, the payment, etc., etc. The economic value of requests like this one can be, and often is, as many of you know, very low. Secondly, there is a database approach. Let's say John's company has a good database that contains the French title. This means that he can identify the contract, access past sales, and collect information he needs to start a negotiation. He will still need to involve parties for approvals, but his data are up to date and he can find everything he needs in the system. Maybe he could use a collaborative editing tool like Google Documents that lets him control the approval process. Maybe that system has an interface to DocuSign or another provider of digital signature. Done. Or thirdly, John could have access to a super system. In this system, most repetitive workflows can be automated. Reminders, notifications of upcoming renewals and expiry dates, outstanding payments, signatures, and tax exemptions. This super system can generate and receive automated royalty reports in a machine-readable format, send and receive machine-readable permission requests, and it would catalog the company's complete archive of rights in a structured way. This would make it possible to identify rights, their owners, and their terms and expiry dates. In this scenario, John's licensing partners don't have to interpret foreign statements, copy them manually into their own systems, and explain them to authors. Now let's hope that Jacqueline's company uses a system that understands the structured codes of the system that John uses. She wouldn't have to write a fuzzy email to John at all. Instead, she would have received an automated notification from John's database, or her own system would have alerted her and generated a machine-readable set of data that she could authorize and forward to John. Maybe she would call John to tell him about a recent review the book received, the upcoming London Book Fair, ask about his kids, tell him about the non-fiction book she needs for her fall catalogue. They would probably need to negotiate the offer, and he would try and convince her to double the advance. The systems would do the rest. Now, why is this utopian? The answer is simple. She says tomato, he says tomato. Jacqueline uses another reference system than John. She isn't aware of this. She has copied and pasted information from her own system into her email, unaware of the fact that John is unable to interpret the data. She thinks about the French translated title of the book. He cannot identify the underlying work or contract. At any rate, two different languages are at work here. Oops. This kind of communication is a typical example of how rights-related messages are transmitted in publishing, and maybe it doesn't matter. Eventually, John and Jacqueline will agree on an offer and prolong the contract. And it doesn't matter how they get there, because the method does not determine the result. The method does, however, determine the time that both spend on achieving that result. In this diagram, the data-based method is the benchmark because that's what it should be. But it's not just about return on invest, even though that is, of course, a legitimate consideration when you think about the sheer number of rights-related messages globally. The lack of a common language in rights is a much bigger problem. And in this talk, I want to show for a moment that it is also an urgent problem. It's urgent because it's about the resilience of our industry, the ability to adapt to changes in the world outside of publishing. Publishing has an artisanal heritage that is of great value to us, and we need to protect it. Publishing is about independence from outside pressures. And even for larger companies, independence among its own imprints is of high value in the world of publishing. Publishing takes the quality of its products seriously. It produces small batches. It invests in maintaining high quality standards, accuracy, fact-checking. Publishing maintains high ethical values. It's an integral part of society's educational system, its cultural heritage, and social development. Publishing advocates authorship. It cares about the value of creative work and protects its economic value. And these are only some of the strengths that this cottage industry has to offer. I'm sure you'll come up with more. However, we also know about the vulnerabilities and the pressures that threaten this heritage. Publishers are dependent on corporate-sized companies to promote and sell their product. In many countries, autocratic tendencies are on the rise. They don't support science-based education, criticism, and debate. They are a threat to publishing. Reading culture is in danger in many countries. Social media make it more difficult for educators to cultivate curiosity, attention to longer portions of text, and skepticism. Authorship and copyright are under pressure from AI-generated content that is perceived as original, and from distribution models that suggest to consumers that creative content is cheap. Is publishing really prepared to deal with all of this? When it comes to rights, publishing is stuck in the 19th century. It's stuck with the idea of producing and trading small batches of high-quality physical objects. And I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but I do believe the need for a change in rights is really urgent. So is this industry prepared for a post-artisanal world where content is immaterial? Let's not forget the dimension of this. It affects millions of contributors, tens of thousands of publishers, thousands of agencies, distributors, aggregators, booksellers, and billions of consumers around the world. Can we afford to be negligent about adapting the mechanics of rights to a new reality? Publishing is not a backward-oriented industry at all. After all, Gutenberg's new technology in book production is a very early example of successful automation processes. There are areas in publishing that already adapted to a new reality and made fit for the future, where automation is well underway. Automated distribution, fulfillment make books available. Metadata management is a central part of publishing already. But it's metadata about product, the object, not about the rights. Wattpad and Instagram and BookTok have been determining the success of authors, their books, and the companies that publish them for maybe 10 years. So I've put a check there as well. Data analysis, market research, and target group analysis, well, actually are the most common rejection lines that I get from German editors. It's often the data about the target group that don't match the book I'm offering. Ironically, these data are rarely quoted when making an offer, especially in fiction. But anyway, publishers know how to interpret data. But then there is that exception, rights. Rights departments are often isolated from their company's data pools. For example, ask yourself, could you compile a list of available audiobook rights for, let's say, the Finnish language? This may seem like an odd request, but many of you know it's not. Audiobook publishers are systematically looking for books in translation that they can reissue in audio. Publishing rights to backlist is terra incognita. Isn't this astonishing? Rights are the engine of publishing. No, it's fuel. And yet, when it comes to data management, this area is underdeveloped. My message today is simple. Avoid data silos. Let the data flow. Data silos are everywhere. They disconnect the rights department from accounting. They disconnect John in New York from Jacqueline in Paris, John from his colleagues, his company from the author's primary agency, and from the rest of the world. Remember how many people and organizations are involved in the rights supply chain around the world. How many books are published per year worldwide? How many royalty reports are produced and emailed or posted to other publishers, agencies, authors? How many permission letters, contract addendum letters, prolongation letters, sub-licenses, and book contracts get signed every year? There is a lot of rights-related information that needs to flow and to become available. But is it even possible to change that? Letting data flow means that computers have to be connected. The connections have to be constructed in a way that allows the exchange of data. Database systems have to be built that way. The connection between databases is basically a manual where one system tells the other how to interact. It's called API, or Application Program Interface. This is simple if the number of computers is small, or if they remain within one set of standards that is controlled by only a few organizations or people, but it's tricky if an entire industry decides it wants its systems to connect. The industry in that case has to establish standards that define the way in which computers exchange data. An independent organization has to establish these standards and define the rules, how to implement and how to use them. Someone has to make sure that everybody can use these standards and issue compliance certificates, conduct audits, educate users, and constantly update its standards to changing needs. Machines speak in languages. We also have to develop a common language. HTML, or hypertext markup language, is such a language. It's become very popular because websites are written in this language, and most of the emails that we receive and send are in HTML. Basically, it tells your computer how to display a set information that it receives from another computer. What you see on the website is not what your computer gets. If you want to see what HTML looks like, turn on the source code view in Google Chrome. The page you have opened will suddenly look very differently. Such a common language has to be readable for machines and ideally for humans too. For it to be a common language, it has to be non-proprietary. That means it has to be available to everybody at no cost. It cannot belong to Microsoft or SAP. It has to be efficient. It has to be simple, transparent, and easy to use. It has to use a standard vocabulary. For example, in this example, an event is narrated in human language and in a set of codes. It's the story of a princess that falls into a coma for several reasons. She eats a poisoned apple that has a toxic effect. But there are other problems, including her primary support group, a dysfunctional family, and people of short stature. It's a complex diagnosis. The World Health Organization has developed a set of codes to make it easier to communicate a diagnosis. The code is not much use to the ER doctor who first arrives at the scene. However, it's useful to communicate the doctor's diagnosis to the princess's health insurance company or maybe another doctor. As you know, the publishing industry uses certain sets of codes to describe the content of a book. BISAC in the USA, FEMA in many other territories, and ISBN, of course, is a widely known standard code format to identify a published product. Publishing also has a common language called ONIX to describe the published object. And as many of you know, Editor in London is the small organization behind ONIX and ISBN. ONIX is a language for published products. It does not have a grammar or a vocabulary to talk about rights. Maybe it could be expanded to also include rights, and there have been attempts. But it's complicated. Rights are complicated because rights are immaterial. The common language for rights in publishing doesn't exist. That language would let us translate a permission request like this one here on this slide into a machine-readable format that a local agent or publisher can transmit to another publisher or the author's primary agent, or indeed to the author. In this example, a debating club in Marseille wants to use several chapters from a book for an online presentation. Admission is not free, the event is commercial, the book is under copyright, money has to be paid, but probably not much. The organizers were lucky enough to find someone who controls those rights and is responsible as an agent, maybe somewhere in the supply chain, for communicating this rights request onwards, evaluate, negotiate, and approve it. This could be a publisher's offer to an author's agent, a licensing offer from a foreign language audiobook publisher, the addendum to an existing contract, or a royalty report. There are many types of rights-related messages. I'm not a developer. I really shouldn't be talking to you about XML, but I encourage those of you who haven't done so already to read about it a little bit, watch a video on YouTube or somewhere, or ask someone who does know XML. If you work for a publisher, chances are you will find your XML masters in the distribution department. It's a fascinating language because it's simple, adaptable, available to the public for free, and here is only a tiny bit from what usually is a much longer set of data. This is an ONIX example. ONIX is an XML language, and these 4 lines in an ONIX message contain information about the book's title. Title is the tag, the whole sequence of characters is an element, it's followed by another element. Code 01 defines the type of the title that follows next. It's defined in ONIX list 15. It means distinctive book title as opposed to former title or title in original language, which is code 03. Anybody can look it up, it's publicly available. Title text indicates that what follows is the title, the backslash marks the end of the title, and so on. XML is not the only language like this. There are others, for example, JSON. They are similar, but it would take a developer to explain the differences. A markup language for rights, like ONIX for published objects, is yet to be developed. It would contain a grammar and a vocabulary that describes the logic not only of rights, types of usage, payments, expiry dates, etc. It would also have to contain words that define the message itself. For example, this is an approval request, or the status update for a contract. Attempts have been made to organize the management of rights. Historically, uncovering the chain of rights for a book must have been virtually impossible before the internet. Editors were reading the Times Literary Supplement and wrote to a book's publisher about its translation rights. Copyright collecting societies are older than the internet, of course, and their job is not to help a German publisher find a primary agent of an American author. But I have listed them here anyhow because VG Wort in Germany or CLA in the UK, because they are an important piece in the supply chain of copyright communication and remuneration. Another example is the University of Reading in the UK has initiated the WATCH project. The acronym stands for Writers and Their Copyright Holders. It's an independently funded research project that catalogs works and their copyright holders. WATCH, like most other such initiatives, assumes that a published book has one copyright holder who is in control of all specific rights. This assumption, of course, is incorrect. WATCH catalogs only published books. This means its use to other publishers is limited because publishers often acquire translation rights to a book before the original edition is published and has an ISBN. But still, this is a noble effort to identify backlist rights and their rights holders. ISNI is a global standard for identifying creative contributors, and those of you who never heard of ISNI should check them out. Get yourselves an ISNI number and make sure your database has a field where you can put a contact's ISNI number. Frankfurt Rights is an online tool that makes it easy to discover the copyright holder of a book and to transmit offers. And I believe Jürgen already has said more about this. And it's used to request and grant permissions. And if you haven't done so, you should definitely check it out. I have listed it here under public because it's operated, as you know, by the Association of German Publishers and Booksellers, whose Frankfurt Book Fair and LitAg, of course, is an enormously useful and powerful organization for the world of rights. In everyday life, publishers help themselves by putting online forms on their website for seekers of rights information. In many cases, these forms will just produce an email to someone who works for the publisher's rights department. Some publishers, like CH Beck in Germany, use a more elaborate information system to display their available rights in a way that shows up-to-date information. Many publishers and agencies, of course, use their annual or biannual rights guides or semi-annual rights guides that they distribute to buyers and interested parties directly on book fairs. And that, in fact, is one of the substantial and most central rights information systems in publishing with rights catalogs, but they are up to date only for a second in the week before the book fair takes place. They are static and mostly transmitted in PDF. And if the book fair goes well, the rights information in Rights Guide is outdated quickly. Emails are used to communicate updates. I've added the Amazon logo here because their catalog is publicly available in countries that have free access to the internet, and it's hands down the standard reference for the industry when it comes to identify a book and its publishers. Amazon, however, as you know, doesn't offer any information about rights. Some important organizations who work on standard practices for the community of publishers are, of course, the Book Industry Study Group, Editeur. I've also mentioned ISCC, a very small non-profit organization that has figured out a way to fingerprint digital content, which is really important because this is one of the weak points in any rights management systems, identifying a work independently from its many physical manifestations. Publishing contracts refer to works, not to ISBNs. A global rights management standard will have to solve the problem of identifying the intellectual property, not the book, and ISCC has found a solution. I've listed XML in this box and open source software because these standards are useful for developing common language for rights and for building non-proprietary software that can interpret that language. The standards that most companies use in their everyday business, however, are set by Microsoft and Adobe, postal services, stationaries. We receive at Moorbooks a couple of thousands of royalty statements per semester. Most of them are printed on DIN A4 paper, wrapped in DIN C5 envelopes, or attached to Outlook emails in Adobe's PDF format. So let me summarize. Doing rights right, in my view, means to increase the discoverability of available rights because this will drive sales up. To establish a global standard for rights reporting, messaging, and transaction. To develop a non-commercial common language for the publishing industry's rights business so that commercial businesses can develop inexpensive software that interacts with other businesses and their software or provides inexpensive software as a service. In my opinion, collaborative software as a service is necessary because it would serve independent small publishers, small businesses, small agencies around the world, protect the core values of publishing, and contribute to the common good. This, however, raises some bigger questions, and I have listed only a very small selection. The industry has to agree on an organization that defines and maintains these standards for a common language. It could be Editeur with an addition to Onyx, it could be somebody else. The industry has to figure out how much it costs to develop a rights standard and who pays for it. And this has to be a global initiative. And it most probably has a political dimension too. And the industry has to make sure that nobody owns those standards. And since this may not be achievable today or this year, what are the questions that companies should ask themselves now in this context? The question that worries me as a small business owner the most is my company's system fit for the future? Like so many others, the system that my agency uses was built in the 1990s and has reached the end of its life cycle. I own a small company, it's also a smart company, but it's a small company. And it's hard for me to develop my own agency software that is fit for the future. Publishers may be in a better position. There are more software providers for publishers than for agencies. But in my experience and my understanding, however, is that rights is not always at the center of the architecture of such solutions. So is there anything we could do right away at all? What could be next steps? Obviously, I can't speak for the industry, but it seems to me that what Chris and Brian are doing here is a great first step. Raise awareness, talk about managing rights, find others who do. Managing rights is a global issue. It has to be addressed on global stages, and everybody has to participate. In my own company, what I could do, if I haven't done so already, is to invest in IT infrastructure. Get rid of spreadsheet culture, Dropbox folders. Don't rely on an Outlook as your single source of truth. Get people to work for you who are IT savvy. Take IT seriously. Define in-house practices, best practices. Find partners to collaborate with. And this may be utterly self-evident or too trivial to even mention, but I'm finding it also very helpful to cultivate precision, to use collaborative tools, to involve co-workers in developing and implementing them, to keep a company Bible or SOPs or a wiki. I know nobody has time for these things, and it's basic business advice, so forgive me. However, one thing I do want to say is prioritize IT. I've been surprised by the lack of interest in IT among some business owners or executives, and it worries me. So on a very pragmatic day-to-day business level, my personal recommendation, and I think this is what you asked, is to establish internal identifiers when referring to contracts or to rights or to people. I don't mean in spoken language among your colleagues, of course, but for example in internal messages. Referring to an ID is a very easy step to make a message shorter and clearer. But does your database even have a work ID? We at Moorbooks use term sheets to report offers, online forms for our partners to report offers to us. We use several collaborative tools that I'd be happy to talk about if you're interested. And I think it's also a good idea to establish a company's best practice how to formulate emails. And it's also useful to develop a company-wide coherent taxonomy to if you can't develop a global taxonomy, at least within the company that everybody uses the same language. So also we at Moorbooks have started work on a new software to replace our old one. It's based on our current agency system and on Rights Desk. It will be a web-based rights management software that is equipped to interact with other systems. And it's a big step for a small company. But I believe the urgency to take a big step is greater now than it was when Germany reunified and had to add another digit to its zip codes. And if anyone is interested, I'd be really interested in talking about partnerships. It would be interesting to work on a software like this with a publisher or an agency who is interested in building, for example, an interface that connects to a publisher system to try out how to receive and send royalty statements in an XML format or in a CSV format or whatever. But someone who can actually take the time to experiment and build a use case. So if you're interested, please be in touch. Thank you so much for your attention.
We have a little time for questions from the room, and then we'll take some questions from people online. Online folks, You can put your questions in the Q&A, right? In the chat, sorry, in the chat. Michael, do you need a microphone? I think you do. For posterity.
First of all, Sebastian, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. I'm sure everybody in the room enjoyed it, at least as much as I did. And thank you for the shout out for ISNI. I'm chairman of the board of ISNI, and anybody who wants an ISNI, come and talk to me. Happily to give you one. A more general observation, the publishing industry as a whole likes standards. We've arguably been very successful at creating them. We have arguably got too many of them, frankly, but that's a conversation for a different day. Our supply chain has been greatly enriched by the adoption of standards, and when it comes to rights, there is this, as you say, this rather black hole. But we do have structured language and taxonomy for rights. We did, I'm also a board member of Editeur, as is Brian here. We developed many years ago Onyx for rights. Mm-hmm. We also developed Onyx for distributions to standardize royalty statements. And they weren't adopted. And this is the distinction I want to make, which is we're good at creating standards, we're less good at adopting them. And frustrating as that might be for those of us who've been involved in the development of those standards, the key point, it seems to me, is, at least in my experience, the difference, what makes the difference between a standard being adopted or not is often the presence of a dominant player in the value chain. I was chairman of International ISBN for many years in the early 2000s, and looking back at the history of the ISBN, the reason it became a worldwide standard was the adoption of it by major retailers, W.H. Smith, Barnes & Noble, etc. When we were trying to evangelize Onyx in the early 2000s, the tipping point, I would argue, some would disagree, was the adoption by Amazon. And they were resistant originally. And that's true of so many standards in my experience. The problem, it seems to me, with the rights marketplace is we don't have a dominant player. We have many small publishers, many small literary agencies, etc., doing fantastic work. But it's really hard in that kind of ecosystem to get adoption.
Yeah. Did you want to make a comment on that? I mean, you're not wrong.
I completely agree, and of course you are in a much better position to talk about this. And of course it is a problem that rights and agenting is a small business industry. Maybe it's even more important because of that, to develop a basis for inexpensive solutions that work for small businesses.
You know, thank goodness we don't have a single dominant rights